The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Valdoria Castle like secrets refusing to be unveiled. Captain Marcus Sterling adjusted his ceremonial sword as he walked the familiar path from the guards' quarters to the main palace, his boots echoing against cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of dutiful footsteps. At 42, Marcus had dedicated more than half his life to the royal guard, rising through ranks not through political maneuvering but through unwavering dedication and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate danger before it materialized. The castle stirred to life around him as servants hurried through their morning routines, their heads bowed in respectful acknowledgement as he passed. Marcus barely noticed these daily rituals anymore, his mind was already focused on the day ahead. Prince Alexander, now 28 and heir to the throne, had become increasingly restless with the constraints of royal protocol. Just last week, there had been another incident where the prince had attempted to slip away from his security detail to visit the lower districts of the capital, claiming he needed to understand the struggles of his future subjects. Marcus understood the prince's motivations, even admired them, but his duty was clear. The world beyond the palace walls had grown increasingly dangerous for members of the royal family. Political tensions had been rising across the neighboring kingdoms, and intelligence reports suggested that revolutionary groups were gaining influence among the common people. The prince's safety was paramount, even if it meant restricting the very freedom that made Alexander the compassionate leader his people needed. As Marcus entered the main palace through the guard's entrance, he was immediately struck by an unusual tension in the air. Servants moved with hurried purpose, their usual morning chatter replaced by hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when they noticed his presence. Something was different today, though Marcus couldn't quite identify what had changed. He made his way through the familiar corridors, past portraits of long-dead monarchs whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movement. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that danced across marble floors polished to mirror brightness. These halls had been his world for so long that he could navigate them blindfolded, yet today they felt somehow foreign, as if the very atmosphere had shifted overnight. Marcus arrived at Prince Alexander's quarters precisely at 7 o'clock, as he had every morning for the past 8 years since being assigned as the prince's personal guard captain. The two guards stationed at the door snapped to attention, their movements crisp and professional. Marcus acknowledged them with a brief nod before knocking on the heavy oak door. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within. Marcus stepped into the prince's private study, a room that reflected Alexander's intellectual nature. Books lined every available wall space, covering subjects ranging from political philosophy to agricultural innovation. Maps of the kingdom and its surrounding territories covered a large table in the center of the room, marked with notes in the prince's careful handwriting. It was here that Alexander spent most of his private hours, studying the realm he would one day rule and developing ideas for improving the lives of his subjects. Prince Alexander stood by the window, still dressed in his sleeping clothes, gazing out at the gardens below where early morning gardeners tended to the royal rose bushes. He was tall and lean, with the dark hair and strong jawline characteristic of the royal bloodline, but his eyes held a depth of thoughtfulness that set him apart from the more traditional members of his family. Those who knew him well recognized the burden of future kingship that he carried, even in quiet moments like this. "Good morning, Your Highness," Marcus said, maintaining the formal tone required by protocol even after years of developing what could almost be called friendship with the prince. "Marcus," Alexander replied, turning from the window with a slight smile. "I trust you slept well. Though I suspect you were up late again reviewing security reports." It was true. Marcus rarely slept more than 5 hours a night, using the quiet evening hours to study intelligence briefings, review guard schedules, and plan security protocols for upcoming royal engagements. Sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford when responsible for protecting someone whose death would plunge the kingdom into chaos. "Your schedule today includes the morning council meeting, followed by a session with the agricultural advisors," Marcus began, consulting the detailed itinerary he had memorized the night before. "This afternoon, you have requested time to review the proposed legislation regarding trade agreements with the northern provinces." Alexander nodded, but Marcus could see the familiar restlessness in his posture. "And I suppose there's no possibility of adding an impromptu visit to the merchants' quarter?" "I've been reading reports about the impact of the new taxation policies, and I believe hearing directly from the affected citizens would provide valuable insight." Your Highness, you know such visits require extensive advance preparation for security purposes, Marcus replied diplomatically. However, if you would like to schedule such a visit, I can begin making arrangements for later this week. The prince sighed, a sound that carried more frustration than anger. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being prepared to rule a kingdom or to live in a magnificent prison. Marcus understood the prince's frustration more deeply than he could express. In his years of service, he had watched Alexander grow from an idealistic young man into a thoughtful leader, but always within the constraints of security protocols and royal expectations. The prince's genuine desire to connect with his future subjects often conflicted with the reality of threats that surrounded the royal family. Your safety ensures the stability of the kingdom, Your Highness, Marcus said, falling back on the words that had guided his service for years. A dead prince cannot serve his people. Yes, I've heard that particular wisdom before, Alexander replied with a wry smile. Very well, Captain. Let us proceed with the day as planned. Though I reserve the right to continue advocating for more direct engagement with our citizens. As they prepared to leave for the morning council meeting, Marcus performed his usual security check. He examined the corridors they would traverse, confirmed the positions of guards along their route, and verified that all security protocols remained in place. It was a routine he had performed thousands of times, yet he never allowed familiarity to breed complacency. The morning council meeting took place in the Great Hall, a vast chamber dominated by a table carved from a single enormous oak tree that had supposedly grown on the castle grounds centuries before the palace was built. Around this table sat the kingdom's most influential advisors, Lord Chancellor Harrington, a shrewd political strategist in his 60s, General Morrison, commander of the kingdom's military forces, Master of Coin Pemberton, whose mathematical mind managed the royal treasury, and several other nobles whose families had served the crown for generations. Marcus positioned himself near the chamber's entrance, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough to avoid interfering with the political discussions. From this vantage point, he could observe both the council members and maintain visual contact with the guards stationed throughout the hall. Prince Alexander took his seat at his father's right hand, though King Henry himself appeared increasingly frail these days. The king's recent illness had been kept from public knowledge, but those within the palace could see how it had aged him. His once commanding presence had diminished, and, more frequently, he deferred to his son during important discussions. The reports from the northern provinces remain concerning, Lord Chancellor Harrington began, spreading several documents across the table. Tax revenues are down significantly, and there have been several instances of civil unrest in the smaller towns. General Morrison leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped before him. My intelligence suggests that some of these disturbances are being orchestrated rather than arising organically. There may be external influences encouraging dissent among our citizens. Marcus listened carefully to these discussions, always alert for information that might affect the royal family's security. Political instability often translated into increased threats against the monarchy, and understanding the broader context helped him anticipate potential dangers. Prince Alexander studied the documents before responding. What specific grievances are driving this unrest? Are we dealing with legitimate concerns about policy, or purely political agitation? A combination of both, Your Highness, Master Pemberton interjected. The new taxation structure has placed additional burden on smaller merchants and farmers, while the larger landowners have found ways to minimize their obligations. The disparity has created genuine hardship in some communities. Then, we need to address the underlying issues, not simply suppress the symptoms, Alexander said firmly. I propose we organize a series of visits to the affected regions, allowing me to hear directly from citizens about their concerns and demonstrate the Crown's commitment to addressing legitimate grievances. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Such visits would be a security nightmare, requiring coordination between local authorities, advance teams to survey venues, background checks on anyone who might come into contact with the prince, and contingency plans for various threat scenarios. More troubling was the prince's tendency to want to interact directly with crowds, making security control nearly impossible. Lord Chancellor Harrington shifted uncomfortably. Your Highness, such direct engagement carries significant risks, both political and personal. Perhaps a more measured approach, working through local administrators and trusted intermediaries, might achieve similar results with less exposure. With respect, Chancellor, working through intermediaries is precisely what has allowed these problems to develop unchecked, Alexander replied. How can I expect to rule effectively if I remain isolated from the very people I'm meant to serve? The debate continued for another hour, touching on various aspects of kingdom management, but Marcus's attention remained focused on the security implications of the prince's proposals. Each suggestion for increased public engagement represented new challenges for protection protocols, yet he recognized the political necessity of the prince maintaining connection with his future subjects. When the council meeting concluded, Marcus escorted Prince Alexander to his next appointment, but he could see that the morning's discussions had only reinforced the prince's desire for greater freedom of movement. This tension between duty and desire was something Marcus dealt with daily, but lately, it seemed to be intensifying. As they walked through the palace corridors, Alexander spoke quietly. Marcus, I know my requests for public engagements create difficulties for your security planning, but I need you to understand something. The crown's legitimacy depends on the consent of the people we govern. If I become so isolated from their reality that I cannot understand their needs, I'll be a failed king before I even take the throne. Marcus considered his response carefully. I understand your concerns, Your Highness, and I respect your dedication to your future subjects. My role is to ensure you live long enough to serve them effectively. Perhaps we can explore ways to increase your public engagement while maintaining adequate security protocols. I appreciate your willingness to consider alternatives, Captain. You've always been more than just a guard to me, you've been a trusted advisor and, dare I say it, a friend. The prince's words carried more weight than he might have realized. Marcus had indeed grown to care deeply about Alexander's well-being, not just as a duty but as genuine affection for a young man trying to navigate the impossible challenges of future kingship. This personal connection sometimes made his protective instincts even stronger, creating an internal conflict between his professional obligations and his personal feelings. The afternoon brought its own challenges. During the session with agricultural advisors, Prince Alexander continued to press for direct engagement with farmers and rural communities. The advisors, mostly older men from noble families with extensive land holdings, seemed uncomfortable with the prince's populist tendencies. Marcus could sense the political undercurrents in their discussions, the subtle resistance to changes that might threaten established power structures. As evening approached, Marcus conducted his final security rounds, checking locks, verifying guard positions, and ensuring that all access points to the royal quarters remained secure. It was during this routine patrol that he noticed something unusual. Light flickered under the door of Queen Mother Isabel's private chambers, though she was supposed to be attending a diplomatic dinner in the capital that evening. Marcus paused, considering whether to investigate. Queen Mother Isabel had never been particularly warm toward him, viewing the guard staff as necessary servants rather than trusted retainers. However, any deviation from expected patterns was potentially significant from a security standpoint. He knocked softly on the chamber door. Your Majesty, this is Captain Sterling. Is everything all right? The door opened slightly, revealing not Queen Mother Isabel but her personal secretary, a thin man named Edmund Hartwell who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. Edmund's usually composed demeanor seemed slightly flustered. Captain Sterling, Her Majesty returned early from her engagement due to a headache. She's requested complete privacy for the evening. Something in Edmund's tone struck Marcus as odd, but he couldn't identify exactly what seemed wrong. Of course. Please convey my wishes for her swift recovery. As Marcus continued his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in the palace's atmosphere. The servants' unusual behavior that morning, the political tensions discussed in council, and now this minor irregularity with the Queen Mother's schedule all contributed to a sense that changes were coming, though he couldn't predict their nature. His final stop was always Prince Alexander's quarters, where he would brief the night guard detail and ensure the prince's immediate environment remained secure. As he approached the familiar doors, Marcus reflected on the conversation they had shared that afternoon about friendship and trust. In a world where political loyalties shifted like sand and personal relationships often served ulterior motives, the bond he had developed with Prince Alexander felt both precious and dangerous. The prince was already preparing for sleep when Marcus entered for his final check. Alexander looked up from the book he had been reading, a philosophical treatise on the responsibilities of leadership. Marcus, before you go, I wanted to thank you for your understanding today. I know my requests create additional challenges for you, but I value your willingness to find solutions rather than simply imposing restrictions. Your Highness, my duty is to serve the crown in whatever capacity best ensures its security and success. If that means adapting our protocols to allow for greater public engagement, then that's what we'll do. Alexander smiled. You know, sometimes I think you understand the burdens of leadership better than some of the nobles who were born to advisory roles. Your perspective has always been valuable to me. As Marcus left the prince's quarters and secured the doors for the night, he carried with him both the warmth of Alexander's trust and an inexplicable sense of foreboding. The palace felt different tonight, charged with an energy he couldn't identify but that triggered every instinct he had developed over years of protecting those who lived within these walls. Standing in the empty corridor outside the prince's chambers, Marcus made a silent promise to himself and to the young man sleeping beyond those doors. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever political storms might threaten the kingdom's stability, he would continue to serve with the same dedication that had defined his career. The prince's safety would remain his highest priority, even if protecting Alexander meant making difficult choices about competing loyalties and conflicting duties. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet, but Marcus remained alert as he made his way to his own quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new requests for public engagement, and new security protocols to develop. Tonight, however, his duty was to rest and prepare for whatever the coming days might bring. Little did he know that the uneasy feeling that had plagued him throughout the day was well-founded, and that events already set in motion would soon test both his professional skills and personal loyalties in ways he had never imagined possible. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first noticed the strange atmosphere in the palace, and the feeling of impending change had only grown stronger. During this time, Prince Alexander's requests for public engagements had become more frequent and more urgent. The prince seemed driven by an almost desperate need to connect with his future subjects, as if sensing that his opportunity to do so freely might soon be limited. Marcus had worked tirelessly to accommodate these requests while maintaining security protocols. They had successfully organized 2 carefully controlled visits to local markets, where Alexander had spoken with merchants and farmers about their concerns. The prince's genuine interest in their problems and his obvious intelligence had made a strong impression on the citizens they encountered. However, these visits had also attracted unwanted attention from groups that Marcus's intelligence sources suggested might pose threats to the royal family. The morning began like any other, with Marcus's routine security briefing in his office before escorting the prince to breakfast. Captain Reynolds, his second-in-command, spread several reports across the desk with an expression that Marcus had learned to recognize as troubled. "We've intercepted communications suggesting increased activity among the revolutionary groups in the eastern provinces," Reynolds began. "Nothing specific yet, but the intelligence pattern suggests they're planning something significant." Marcus studied the documents carefully. The reports detailed meetings in taverns and private homes, purchases of weapons and supplies, and movement of known agitators between different regions. Individually, these activities might seem insignificant, but together they painted a picture of organized preparation for some kind of action. "Any indication that these activities are directed toward the royal family specifically?" Marcus asked. "Not explicitly, but several of the intercepted conversations mentioned removing obstacles to progress and dealing with symbols of oppression. Given the prince's recent public appearances, it's reasonable to assume the royal family might be considered such symbols." Marcus felt his protective instincts sharpen. After years of dealing with various threats, he had developed an ability to distinguish between general political unrest and specific dangers to his charges. The pattern Reynolds described felt like the latter. Double the security detail for all royal family members, Marcus decided. "And I want background checks updated on anyone who might come into contact with Prince Alexander during his scheduled activities." "There's something else," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping slightly. "We've noticed some unusual visitors to Queen Mother Isabel's chambers over the past week. Her secretary, Edmund, has been meeting with individuals who aren't part of the regular palace staff or known associates." This information sent a chill through Marcus. Queen Mother Isabel had always been a formidable political figure, with connections throughout the nobility and influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. Any unusual activity in her sphere could have significant implications for the royal family's security. Do we have identification on these visitors? Partial. One appears to be Lord Blackwood's personal representative, though we're still trying to confirm the purpose of his visits. Another is a man named Professor Aldrich, who claims to be a historian researching royal genealogies for academic purposes. Marcus knew Lord Blackwood by reputation, an ambitious noble from the northern provinces who had been vocal in his criticism of some recent royal policies. The man had never explicitly opposed the crown, but he had positioned himself as a champion of noble privileges that had been curtailed by King Henry's reforms. If Blackwood was secretly communicating with Queen Mother Isabel, it could indicate political maneuvering that might affect Prince Alexander's future reign. Monitor these meetings discreetly, Marcus instructed. But be extremely careful. The Queen Mother commands significant influence, and any perceived surveillance could have serious consequences for our positions. After concluding his briefing with Reynolds, Marcus made his way to Prince Alexander's quarters. The corridor seemed unusually quiet this morning, with fewer servants than normal attending to their duties. When he knocked and entered the prince's study, he found Alexander standing by the window again, but this time his posture suggested deep concern rather than mere contemplation. "Marcus, thank goodness you're here," the prince said, turning with obvious relief. "I need to speak with you about something troubling that happened last night." Marcus felt his alertness spike. "What kind of incident, Your Highness?" Alexander gestured for Marcus to take a seat, an unusual formality that suggested the matter was serious. "I couldn't sleep, so I decided to walk through the gardens around midnight. I know it wasn't the wisest decision from a security standpoint, but I needed air and solitude to think through some of the political challenges we discussed yesterday." Marcus struggled to maintain his composure. The prince leaving his quarters unescorted at midnight represented exactly the kind of security breach that kept him awake at night. However, his immediate concern was what Alexander might have witnessed during this unauthorized excursion. "During my walk, I noticed lights in my grandmother's private chambers, which seemed strange given the hour. I was about to return to my rooms when I saw several men leaving through the side entrance that connects to her quarters. They weren't dressed as palace staff, and they seemed to be taking great care to move quietly and avoid the main corridors." "Can you describe these men?" "One was tall and well-dressed, possibly a nobleman based on his bearing. Another appeared to be middle-aged, wearing scholars' robes. There was a third man I couldn't see clearly, but his posture suggested he might have been a soldier or guard. They spoke in low voices, and, while I couldn't hear specific words, their tone suggested urgency, possibly even conspiracy." Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind, though the complete picture remained unclear. The timing of these secret meetings, combined with increased revolutionary activity in the provinces and Prince Alexander's growing popularity with common citizens, suggested political maneuvering that could have serious implications for the royal family's future. "Your Highness, I need you to promise me something. No more unauthorized excursions, regardless of the circumstances. If you need solitude, please request it through proper channels so we can ensure your safety while accommodating your needs." Alexander nodded seriously. "I understand, Marcus. Last night made me realize how much I've been taking my security for granted. But what concerns me more is the possibility that my grandmother is involved in activities that could affect the kingdom's stability." This was delicate territory. Marcus had sworn an oath to protect the entire royal family, which technically included Queen Mother Isabel. However, his primary responsibility was Prince Alexander's safety, and if the Queen Mother's activities posed a threat to the prince, his loyalties would be tested in ways he had never anticipated. "I'll investigate these concerns discreetly," Marcus assured him. "In the meantime, I recommend maintaining normal interactions with the Queen Mother while remaining alert for anything unusual in her behavior or requests." The remainder of the morning proceeded according to schedule, but Marcus found his attention divided between his immediate duties and the implications of what Alexander had witnessed. During the prince's meeting with the kingdom's trade advisors, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings while considering the potential connections between various political developments. The trade advisors brought concerning news about increased tariffs imposed by neighboring kingdoms, which were affecting the prosperity of border regions. Several mentioned that influential nobles in these areas were growing restless with the current administration's handling of foreign relations. Marcus noticed that one advisor, Lord Pemberton, seemed particularly interested in the political ramifications of these economic challenges. "Your Highness," Pemberton said during the discussion, "perhaps it would be wise to consider appointing a special envoy to address these trade disputes. Someone with both diplomatic experience and strong connections among the nobility might be able to resolve these issues more effectively than traditional channels." Alexander considered this suggestion thoughtfully. "Do you have someone specific in mind for such a position?" "Well, Lord Blackwood has extensive experience with northern trade routes and maintains excellent relationships with nobles in the affected regions. He might be an ideal candidate for this kind of diplomatic mission." Marcus felt his attention sharpen at the mention of Blackwood's name. The same noble whose representative had been secretly meeting with Queen Mother Isabel was now being suggested for a position that would give him additional influence over kingdom policy. The coincidence seemed too convenient to be accidental. After the meeting concluded, Marcus escorted Prince Alexander to lunch, but his mind remained focused on the emerging pattern of connections. During their walk, he decided to probe gently for additional information. "Your Highness, what's your assessment of Lord Blackwood's suitability for the diplomatic position discussed this morning?" Alexander was quiet for a moment before responding. "Blackwood is certainly qualified from a technical standpoint. He understands trade, has connections, and speaks persuasively. But I've always sensed something opportunistic about his loyalty to the crown. He seems more interested in advancing his own position than in serving the kingdom's best interests." "Have you discussed your concerns about Blackwood with the king?" "My father's illness has made such discussions difficult. He tires easily and often defers to my grandmother's judgment on political matters. And grandmother has always spoken highly of Blackwood's capabilities." This revelation provided another piece of the puzzle Marcus was trying to solve. If Queen Mother Isabel was advocating for Blackwood while secretly meeting with his representatives, it suggested a level of coordination that could indicate plans beyond simple political maneuvering. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. Marcus was reviewing security preparations for an upcoming state dinner when Captain Reynolds approached with urgent news. "Sir, we've intercepted a message that I think you need to see immediately." Reynolds handed him a decoded communication that had been intercepted from one of the revolutionary groups they had been monitoring. The message was brief but deeply concerning. "The Crown Prince's popularity with the people makes him dangerous to our cause. Alternative succession must be secured before he gains more influence." Marcus read the message twice before fully grasping its implications. The revolutionary groups weren't simply planning random violence against the monarchy, they were specifically targeting Prince Alexander because his connection with common citizens threatened their ability to present the royal family as oppressive and out of touch. "Where did this originate?" Marcus asked. "Eastern provinces, but it was addressed to someone in the capital. We haven't been able to identify the recipient yet, but the message suggests there are sympathizers within the city, possibly even within noble circles." The pieces of the conspiracy were becoming clearer, though the complete picture remained elusive. Revolutionary groups wanted to eliminate Prince Alexander specifically. Queen Mother Isabel was conducting secret meetings with political figures who might benefit from changes in succession, and now there were indications that these separate threats might be connected. Marcus made a decision that would have significant consequences. "Reynolds, I want you to organize a discreet surveillance operation on Queen Mother Isabel's activities. Document everyone who visits her chambers, record the times and duration of meetings, and try to identify any patterns in her correspondence." "Sir, that's an extremely dangerous order. If the Queen Mother discovers we're monitoring her activities, she could have us dismissed or worse." "I'm aware of the risks, but Prince Alexander's safety takes precedence over our career security. If there's any possibility that threats against the prince are connected to activities within the palace itself, we need to know." That evening, Marcus conducted his security rounds with heightened alertness. Every shadow seemed potentially threatening, every unusual sound triggered his protective instincts. When he arrived at Queen Mother Isabel's chambers, he noticed that light was again visible under her door despite the late hour. Instead of knocking as he had before, Marcus positioned himself in an alcove where he could observe without being detected. After waiting nearly an hour, he was rewarded when the door opened and 3 men emerged. Even in the dim corridor lighting, Marcus could recognize the tall, well-dressed figure that Prince Alexander had described. The second man was indeed wearing scholar's robes, and the third had the bearing of a military officer. Marcus followed at a distance as the men made their way through corridors that avoided the main guard stations. Their knowledge of the palace layout suggested either inside assistance or careful advance planning. When they reached a side entrance that Marcus knew was supposed to be secured, one of the men produced a key and opened the door without triggering any alarms. This level of access could only be achieved with help from someone who had authority over palace security systems. Marcus felt a cold realization settle over him. The conspiracy against Prince Alexander involved not only external threats but also betrayal from within the royal household itself. Returning to his quarters, Marcus spent the remainder of the night developing plans to protect the prince while gathering evidence about the conspiracy. He knew that accusations against Queen Mother Isabel would require absolute proof, and that moving too quickly could alert the conspirators and put Alexander in greater danger. The next morning brought news that confirmed Marcus's worst fears. King Henry had suffered another episode during the night and was now confined to bed under the care of royal physicians. The king's declining health meant that Queen Mother Isabel would assume even greater influence over palace affairs, while Prince Alexander would face increasing pressure to prepare for imminent kingship. When Marcus arrived at Alexander's quarters, he found the prince already dressed and clearly troubled by the news about his father's condition. "Marcus, everything is changing so quickly," Alexander said as soon as the door closed behind them. "My father's illness is progressing faster than anyone expected, and I'm not sure I'm prepared for the responsibilities that may soon fall to me." "Your Highness, you've been preparing for kingship your entire life. Your dedication to understanding your future subjects and your commitment to just governance demonstrate that you'll be an excellent ruler when the time comes." Alexander appreciated the reassurance, but Marcus could see the weight of impending responsibility in his expression. "There's something else troubling me. Yesterday, my grandmother suggested that I should consider appointing Lord Blackwood as my chief advisor when I become king. She presented it as wise political strategy, but something about her urgency made me uncomfortable." This information provided crucial confirmation of the conspiracy's scope. Queen Mother Isabel wasn't simply meeting with Blackwood's representatives, she was actively working to position him for influence over Alexander's future reign. The implications were staggering. If successful, this maneuvering could effectively give Blackwood control over kingdom policy through his influence over a young and inexperienced king. "What was your response to her suggestion?" "I told her I would consider all qualified candidates when making such important appointments. I didn't want to refuse directly, but I also didn't want to commit to a decision I'm not comfortable with." "That was wise, Your Highness. It's important to maintain diplomatic relationships while preserving your authority to make independent decisions." Throughout that day, Marcus struggled with the knowledge he had gained and the decisions he would soon face. His investigation had revealed enough evidence to confirm that Prince Alexander was facing threats both from external revolutionary groups and from political maneuvering within his own family. The conspiracy was more complex and dangerous than he had initially suspected, involving coordination between multiple parties who saw different advantages in either eliminating or controlling the future king. As evening approached, Marcus realized that events were moving faster than his ability to gather complete evidence. The king's deteriorating health meant that Alexander might inherit the throne within days or weeks, and the conspirators would likely accelerate their plans accordingly. Marcus would soon be forced to choose between his oath to protect the entire royal family and his specific duty to ensure Prince Alexander's safety. Standing outside the prince's chambers for his final security check of the day, Marcus made a decision that would define the remainder of his career and possibly the future of the kingdom. Tomorrow, he would begin taking active measures to protect Prince Alexander from all threats, regardless of their source or the personal consequences for his own position. The game of palace intrigue had reached a crucial phase, and Marcus Sterling was about to discover that sometimes protecting the crown requires betraying those who wear it. The dawn that broke over Valdoria Castle on the fourth week of Marcus's investigation brought with it a sense of impending crisis that seemed to permeate the very stones of the ancient fortress. King Henry had taken a turn for the worse during the night, and the royal physicians had been summoned urgently to his bedside. Word spread quickly through the palace that the king's condition was grave, and that preparations should begin for the possibility of Prince Alexander's imminent coronation. Marcus had received this news before sunrise from Captain Reynolds, who had been monitoring communications throughout the night. The timing seemed suspicious given everything they had observed about the conspiracy surrounding the prince. As Marcus dressed and prepared for what he sensed would be a crucial day, he reflected on the intelligence they had gathered and the decisions that now lay before him. The surveillance of Queen Mother Isabel's activities had revealed a pattern that was both disturbing and increasingly urgent. Over the past week, her secret meetings had become more frequent, and the participants had expanded to include several additional nobles whose loyalty to Prince Alexander was questionable. Most concerning was the discovery that Edmund Hartwell, the Queen Mother's secretary, had been receiving and sending coded messages through channels that bypassed normal palace security protocols. When Marcus arrived at Prince Alexander's quarters, he found the prince already awake and dressed, standing before a window that overlooked the courtyard where castle staff were beginning their daily activities. Alexander's posture conveyed the weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon him, and Marcus could see that the young man was struggling to process the magnitude of the changes occurring around him. "Marcus," Alexander said without turning from the window, "the physicians believe my father may not survive another week. I'm about to become king of Valdoria, and I'm not certain I'm ready for the challenges that await." Marcus approached carefully, recognizing that this conversation would be different from their usual morning briefings. The dynamic between them was shifting as Alexander prepared to transition from protected prince to sovereign ruler, and Marcus needed to adapt his role accordingly while maintaining his protective responsibilities. "Your Highness, you've spent years preparing for this moment through your study of governance, your engagement with citizens, and your dedication to understanding the kingdom's needs. The qualities that make you compassionate will also make you strong when leadership is required." Alexander turned to face him with an expression that combined gratitude with deep concern. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you. Last night, my grandmother visited me with urgent advice about the transition of power. She insisted that I needed to make immediate appointments to key positions to ensure stability during the coronation period. Specifically, she wants me to name Lord Blackwood as my chief advisor and grant him broad authority over domestic policy." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the scenario he had feared. The conspiracy was moving to its final phase, using the king's illness as an opportunity to position Blackwood for control over Alexander's reign before the new king could fully understand the political landscape he was inheriting. "What was your response?" "I told her that such important decisions deserved careful consideration and that I wanted to review all qualified candidates before making appointments. She became quite insistent, almost agitated, claiming that delay could be interpreted as weakness by the nobility and might encourage political instability." "Your instinct to proceed carefully was correct, Your Highness. Major appointments made during times of crisis often have long-lasting consequences that are difficult to reverse once established." Alexander nodded, but Marcus could see that he remained troubled. "There's more, Marcus. She also suggested that it might be wise to replace some of the current guard leadership with personnel who have stronger connections to the northern nobles. She specifically mentioned that you, while loyal and capable, might lack the political sophistication needed to protect a king rather than a prince." This revelation confirmed Marcus's worst suspicions. The conspiracy wasn't simply aimed at influencing Prince Alexander's policies, it involved replacing the entire security structure that protected him with personnel loyal to the conspirators. Once that was accomplished, the new king would be completely vulnerable to manipulation or elimination. "Your Highness, I need to share some information with you that may be difficult to hear, but which is essential for your safety and the security of your future reign." Alexander's expression became serious as he recognized the gravity in Marcus's tone. "Go on." Marcus spent the next hour revealing everything he had discovered about the conspiracy. He described the intercepted communications from revolutionary groups specifically targeting Alexander, the pattern of secret meetings in Queen Mother Isabel's chambers, the suspicious timing of suggestions about Lord Blackwood's advancement, and the evidence of coordination between internal and external threats to the prince's safety. Alexander listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly pale as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. When Marcus finished his briefing, the prince sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what he had learned. "You're telling me that my own grandmother, the woman who helped raise me, is involved in a plot that could result in my death or political subjugation?" "I'm telling you that the evidence strongly suggests coordination between various parties who would benefit from either your elimination or your control. Whether Queen Mother Isabel fully understands the consequences of her actions or believes she's serving the kingdom's best interests, her activities are creating dangerous vulnerabilities in your security." Alexander stood and paced to the window again, staring out at the kingdom he was about to inherit. "Marcus, if what you've discovered is accurate, then I'm facing threats not just from external enemies but from within my own family. How can I become king under such circumstances? How can I trust anyone?" "You can trust those who have demonstrated loyalty through actions rather than words," Marcus replied. "You can trust the security protocols we've developed to protect you. And you can trust your own judgment about what kind of ruler you want to become, regardless of the political pressures surrounding you." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Captain Reynolds entered with obvious urgency. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. We've intercepted communications indicating that something significant is planned for today." The timing coincides with the king's deteriorating condition. Marcus felt the conspiracy entering its final phase. "What kind of communications?" "Multiple coded messages sent to various locations within the capital, all containing references to the moment of transition and necessary changes for stability. We also observed unusual activity around the palace perimeter during the early morning hours." Alexander looked between Marcus and Reynolds with growing alarm. "Are you saying that my father's illness is being used as cover for whatever the conspirators have planned?" "It appears so, Your Highness. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental." Marcus made a decision that would fundamentally alter his relationship with the royal family. "Reynolds, implement emergency security protocols immediately. I want additional guards positioned at all entrances to the royal quarters, and I want background verification on every palace employee who might come into contact with Prince Alexander today." "What about Queen Mother Isabel's schedule?" Marcus looked directly at Prince Alexander before responding. "Her movements are to be monitored and documented. If she requests meetings with external visitors, those meetings are to be delayed pending security clearance." Alexander understood the implications of this order. "Marcus, you're placing my grandmother under effective house arrest based on suspicions rather than proof." "Your Highness, I'm placing the safety of the future king above all other considerations, as my oath requires. If Queen Mother Isabel is innocent of wrongdoing, these precautions will simply be temporary inconveniences. If she's involved in activities that threaten your safety, these measures might save your life." The morning proceeded under the heightened security protocols Marcus had implemented. Prince Alexander attended to the urgent business required by his father's condition, but every meeting and interaction was carefully monitored. The additional security measures created tension throughout the palace, as staff and nobles found their usual access restricted and their movements subject to scrutiny. Around midday, the crisis Marcus had anticipated finally materialized. Captain Reynolds arrived with reports that a group of armed men had been discovered in the capital, apparently positioning themselves near routes that Prince Alexander commonly used when traveling between the palace and other locations. At the same time, intercepted communications revealed that the timing of these movements was coordinated with planned activities within the palace itself. "They're planning something for this afternoon," Reynolds reported. "The external group is positioned to intercept the prince if he leaves the palace, while internal communications suggest that someone inside will create an opportunity for such movement." Marcus realized that the conspiracy had reached the point where protecting Prince Alexander required direct confrontation with the forces arrayed against him. "Your Highness, I need you to remain in your quarters under heavy guard while we address these threats. Anyone who requests your presence elsewhere today should be considered potentially hostile. Including my grandmother? Including anyone whose activities we cannot independently verify as safe. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the door. Edmund Hartwell, Queen Mother Isabel's secretary, entered with what appeared to be urgent business. Your Highness, the Queen Mother requests your immediate presence in her chambers. There are critical matters regarding the transition of power that require urgent discussion with Lord Blackwood and other advisors who have arrived for emergency consultations. Marcus felt every instinct he had developed over years of protecting the royal family activate. The timing of this request, combined with everything they had discovered about the conspiracy, made it clear that this was the moment when the plotters intended to spring their trap. I'm afraid His Highness is not available for meetings at this time due to security concerns, Marcus responded firmly. Edmund's composed demeanor faltered slightly. Captain Sterling, the Queen Mother was quite specific that this matter could not wait. She mentioned that delay could have serious consequences for the kingdom's stability during this critical period. Alexander started to respond, but Marcus stepped forward. Mr. Hartwell, please inform Her Majesty that all meetings with Prince Alexander must be cleared through security protocols that are currently in effect due to threats against the royal family. We can schedule a meeting once these protocols have been satisfied. I don't think you understand, Captain. The Queen Mother was not making a request. She was issuing a summons that His Highness is expected to honor immediately. Marcus realized that the moment of choice he had been anticipating had arrived. He could either allow Prince Alexander to walk into what he believed was a trap, or he could take actions that would irrevocably pit him against Queen Mother Isabel and potentially cost him his position and career. Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid that will not be possible today. His Highness will remain in secure quarters until the current threat assessment can be resolved. Edmund's expression hardened. Captain Sterling, I believe you may be overstepping your authority. The Queen Mother commands significant influence over security matters within the palace. My authority comes from my oath to protect the prince's life above all other considerations. That oath supersedes any other commands or influences. As Edmund left to report this confrontation to Queen Mother Isabel, Marcus knew that events had been set in motion that would determine not only Prince Alexander's fate but the future direction of the kingdom itself. The conspiracy had been forced into the open, and the next few hours would reveal whether his efforts to protect the prince had been sufficient to counter the threats arrayed against him. Alexander sat quietly during this exchange, but, as soon as Edmund departed, he spoke with a gravity that reflected his growing understanding of the situation's seriousness. Marcus, by refusing my grandmother's summons, you've essentially declared that you believe she poses a threat to my safety. There's no going back from such a position. No, Your Highness, there isn't. But, I believe the evidence supports that conclusion, and my duty is to act on that belief regardless of the personal consequences. Prince Alexander studied his captain's face, recognizing the courage required to take such a stand. Then, we move forward together, whatever the cost. If my own family has turned against me, then, I'm grateful to have someone whose loyalty is absolute. Marcus felt the weight of that trust, knowing that the decisions he made in the coming hours would determine whether he had truly protected his prince or had destroyed them both through misguided suspicion. The conspiracy had finally been forced into the open, and now all parties would have to reveal their true intentions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the palace corridors as Marcus Sterling prepared for what he knew would be the defining confrontation of his career. Word had spread quickly throughout the castle that Prince Alexander was refusing to answer Queen Mother Isabel's summons, and the resulting tension had created an atmosphere of barely contained crisis. Servants moved through their duties with nervous efficiency, nobles whispered in clusters throughout the halls, and guards found themselves uncertain about which orders to follow and from whom. Marcus had positioned his most trusted men at strategic points throughout the royal quarters, creating multiple layers of security around Prince Alexander's chambers. Captain Reynolds coordinated communications between these positions, ensuring that any attempt to breach their defensive perimeter would be immediately detected and countered. They had also established secure communication channels with loyal guards stationed throughout the palace, creating an intelligence network that would alert them to any coordinated moves against the prince. The first sign that the conspiracy was moving to its final phase came when Lord Blackwood himself arrived at the palace with a substantial entourage of guards and advisors. His unexpected appearance, combined with the timing of the king's illness and the pressure for immediate political appointments, confirmed that the plotters believed their moment of opportunity had arrived. Prince Alexander stood by his window, watching the activity in the courtyard below as Blackwood's party entered the palace. The prince's calm exterior masked the internal struggle Marcus knew he was experiencing as he prepared to confront threats that originated within his own family. "Marcus," Alexander said quietly, "I can see Blackwood's men positioning themselves near the main entrances. Their formation suggests military training rather than ceremonial guards." Marcus joined the prince at the window and observed the scene below. Blackwood had indeed brought what appeared to be a small private army disguised as a diplomatic entourage. Their movements and positioning indicated preparation for controlling access to the palace rather than simply providing protection for their lord. "Your Highness, we may need to consider the possibility that this confrontation will involve more than political maneuvering. If they're prepared to use force to achieve their objectives, we must be ready to respond accordingly." A sharp knock interrupted their observation. Captain Reynolds entered with urgent intelligence that confirmed their worst fears. "Sir, we've observed coordinated movements throughout the capital. The revolutionary groups we've been monitoring have positioned themselves at key points around the city, apparently waiting for some kind of signal. At the same time, several nobles known to be associated with Lord Blackwood have arrived at the palace with their personal guards." "How many men are we facing?" "Difficult to determine exactly, but our estimates suggest they could have between 50 and 70 armed men within the palace grounds, with additional forces positioned throughout the capital. Against that, we have perhaps 30 guards whose loyalty we can absolutely confirm." Prince Alexander turned from the window with an expression of grim determination. "So they're not simply planning to manipulate my political decisions. They intend to take control of the palace itself." Marcus felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that had guided his service for so many years, but now it was amplified by the recognition that they faced an existential threat to both the prince's life and the legitimate succession of the crown. "Your Highness, we need to make a decision about how to proceed. We can attempt to negotiate with the conspirators, try to escape the palace and rally loyal forces elsewhere, or make a stand here and force them to reveal their true intentions." Alexander considered these options carefully. "What would you recommend, Marcus?" "I believe we should force them to act openly. If they're planning treason, making them commit to it explicitly will clarify the political situation for any nobles who might be uncertain about their loyalties. It will also provide clear justification for any actions we take to defend your legitimate claim to the throne. Even if that means potentially sacrificing our tactical advantages? Your legitimacy as the rightful heir is our greatest strategic asset. If we can force them to act as obvious traitors, many nobles who might otherwise remain neutral will be compelled to support you." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock, more insistent than the previous ones. This time, it was Edmund Hartwell accompanied by 2 guards Marcus didn't recognize. "Your Highness," Edmund announced formally, "Queen Mother Isabel and Lord Blackwood request your immediate presence in the Great Hall for an emergency session of the Royal Council. The kingdom's stability requires urgent action regarding the succession, and delay is no longer acceptable." Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between the secretary and Prince Alexander. "As I explained earlier, His Highness is not available for meetings that have not been cleared through current security protocols." One of the guards accompanying Edmund spoke for the first time. "Captain Sterling, you have been relieved of your position by order of Queen Mother Isabel. You are to surrender your weapons and submit to escort from the palace grounds immediately." Marcus felt the moment crystallize around him. The conspiracy had finally moved openly against him, which meant they were also moving openly against Prince Alexander. His response to this challenge would determine the course of everything that followed. "I serve at the pleasure of Prince Alexander, and my authority derives from his command. Until he dismisses me, I continue to hold my position and my responsibilities. The Queen Mother's authority supersedes that of a prince during periods of royal transition," the guard replied. You will comply immediately or face consequences for insubordination. Prince Alexander stepped forward, his voice carrying a new authority that Marcus had never heard before. Captain Sterling serves as my personal guard by my command and, with my confidence. Any attempt to remove him without my consent constitutes an act of aggression against my person. Edmund's diplomatic composure finally cracked completely. Your Highness, you are being ill-advised by men whose loyalty is questionable. Lord Blackwood and the Queen Mother have the kingdom's best interests at heart, and their guidance during this transition is essential for maintaining stability. Then, let them make their case through proper channels rather than through ultimatums and threats, Alexander replied firmly. I will not be summoned like a child or coerced into making decisions that affect the future of this kingdom. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, with Edmund and his escort becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to compel the prince's compliance. Finally, they departed with threats that the consequences of continued resistance would be severe. As soon as they were alone again, Marcus turned to Prince Alexander with both admiration and concern. Your Highness, you've just declared yourself in open opposition to whatever plan they've developed. They'll now be forced to either retreat or escalate to direct action. I understand that, Marcus. But, I also understand that once I yield to coercion, I'll never again be able to govern as an independent ruler. If they can intimidate me into compliance today, they'll control every significant decision I make as king. Within an hour, the palace's atmosphere had shifted from tension to open crisis. Nobles were gathering in various chambers, clearly choosing sides based on their assessment of which faction was likely to prevail. Servants found themselves caught between conflicting orders from different authorities, and the normal functioning of the castle had essentially ceased. Marcus received reports from his network of loyal guards that revealed the scope of the conspiracy's preparations. Lord Blackwood had indeed brought a substantial military force, which was now positioned to control key areas of the palace. Queen Mother Isabel had issued orders countermanding existing security protocols and replacing key personnel with individuals loyal to their faction. Most concerning, communications had been intercepted indicating that the external revolutionary groups were prepared to act if given a specific signal from within the palace. They're planning to present the kingdom with a fait accompli, Marcus explained to Prince Alexander as they reviewed the intelligence. They'll take control of the palace, present you with a choice between cooperation and death, and use the chaos to justify whatever political changes they want to implement. What signal are the external groups waiting for? We believe it's connected to an announcement about your status. If they can declare that you've been killed or have abdicated, the revolutionary groups will use that as justification for uprising throughout the kingdom. The resulting chaos would allow Blackwood and his allies to seize power while claiming they're restoring order. Alexander absorbed this information with the same thoughtful consideration he had always applied to complex problems, but Marcus could see that the weight of responsibility was transforming the young man before his eyes. The prince who had chafed at security restrictions was becoming a king who understood the true cost of leadership. Marcus, I need you to know that whatever happens in the next few hours, I'm grateful for your service and your loyalty. You've protected not just my life, but my ability to become the kind of ruler I want to be. Your Highness, my service has been the greatest honor of my life. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As evening approached, the final phase of the conspiracy began to unfold. A formal summons arrived, this time signed by both Queen Mother Isabel and Lord Blackwood, demanding Prince Alexander's appearance in the Great Hall for an emergency session that would address the succession crisis created by his refusal to accept proper guidance during the transition period. The language of the summons made clear that they intended to present Alexander with an ultimatum: accept their control or be declared unfit to rule. Either outcome would serve their purposes, as cooperation would give them power over the future king while resistance would provide justification for replacing him entirely. Marcus assembled his most trusted guards for what he knew might be their final briefing. These men had served with him for years, and their loyalty to both him and Prince Alexander had been tested in numerous situations. Now he was asking them to take a stand that could cost them their lives. Gentlemen, the situation is clear. Forces within the palace are moving against Prince Alexander's legitimate claim to the throne. We have sworn oaths to protect the royal family, but, when members of that family turn against each other, we must choose which oath takes precedence. I believe our highest duty is to protect the rightful succession and the kingdom's stability. If you disagree, you can leave now without judgment. None of the guards moved. Captain Reynolds spoke for the group. Sir, we've served under your command because we respect your judgment and your dedication to duty. If you believe Prince Alexander represents the kingdom's legitimate future, that's enough for us. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for these men who were willing to risk everything based on their trust in his leadership. Very well. We go to the Great Hall, but we go prepared for any outcome. Our objective is to protect Prince Alexander and expose the conspiracy for what it truly is. As they prepared to leave the safety of the royal quarters, Marcus reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. His investigation had revealed the truth about the threats facing Prince Alexander, but acting on that truth had forced a confrontation that would determine the future of the kingdom. In the next hour, he would discover whether his loyalty and judgment had been sufficient to protect the prince he had served so faithfully, or whether his efforts had simply led them both to destruction. The walk through the palace corridors toward the Great Hall felt like a march toward destiny, with each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that would resolve the crisis one way or another. Marcus had spent his career preparing for threats to the royal family, but he had never imagined that the greatest threat would come from within the family itself, or that protecting his prince would require him to choose between competing loyalties that had once seemed perfectly aligned. As they approached the massive doors of the Great Hall, Marcus could hear the murmur of voices within, indicating that the various factions had assembled for what they clearly expected to be the decisive moment of their conspiracy. Prince Alexander walked beside him with the dignity befitting a future king, ready to face whatever judgment awaited him beyond those doors. The Great Hall of Valdoria Castle had never felt more imposing than it did in the moments before Marcus Stirling pushed open its massive doors to escort Prince Alexander into what he knew would be the defining confrontation of both their lives. The ancient chamber, which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies and political deliberations, was now the stage for a struggle that would determine not only the succession of the crown but the very nature of the kingdom's future governance. As they entered, Marcus immediately assessed the positioning of the various factions that had assembled for this crucial meeting. Queen Mother Isabel sat in her traditional place at the head of the great oak table, her expression displaying the regal authority she had wielded for decades. To her right, Lord Blackwood occupied a chair that should have been reserved for the most senior royal advisor, his presence there a clear statement of the power he expected to wield. Around the table sat nearly 24 nobles, their faces revealing the calculations each had made about which side offered the best prospects for their own continued influence. Most concerning to Marcus was the obvious military presence in the hall. Guards wearing the colors of various noble houses stood at strategic points throughout the chamber, significantly outnumbering the royal guards who would normally provide security for such a gathering. The message was unmistakable. This was not a political negotiation but a show of force designed to compel Prince Alexander's compliance with demands he had not yet heard. Prince Alexander entered the hall with a composure that impressed Marcus even as it worried him. The young man who had spent weeks chafing against security restrictions and political protocols now displayed the natural authority of someone born to rule, walking with measured dignity toward the chair that should have been his by right but which was now clearly being offered as a conditional privilege. Queen Mother Isabel rose as Alexander approached, her gesture commanding the attention of everyone present. Alexander, my dear grandson, I'm relieved that you finally decided to join us for this essential discussion about the kingdom's future. Recent events have made it clear that immediate action is required to ensure stability during your father's illness and the transition period that lies ahead. Marcus positioned himself near Alexander's chair, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough to avoid appearing confrontational. From this vantage point, he could observe both the assembled nobles and the various guards stationed throughout the hall, watching for any signs that the meeting might turn violent. Grandmother, Alexander replied formally, I'm always willing to discuss matters of importance to the kingdom's welfare. However, I must express concern about the unusual circumstances surrounding this gathering and the apparent militarization of what should be a political discussion. Lord Blackwood leaned forward, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed victory was within his grasp. Your Highness, the presence of additional security reflects the dangerous times we face. Revolutionary groups threaten the stability of the realm, and your recent public appearances have unfortunately made you a specific target of their activities. We're here to discuss measures that will protect both your safety and the kingdom's continuity. Marcus felt his suspicions confirmed by Blackwood's opening statement. The Lord was positioning himself as protector rather than threat, setting up justifications for the restrictions and controls they were about to propose. It was a masterful piece of political theater designed to make coercion appear as concerned guidance. What specific measures are you proposing? Alexander asked, his tone neutral but his eyes alert to the implications of whatever answer he would receive. Queen Mother Isabel resumed her seat and gestured for Alexander to do the same, a move that would have placed him in a position where he was surrounded by potentially hostile forces. Marcus touched the prince's arm lightly, a subtle signal that accepting such positioning might be inadvisable. Alexander remained standing. I prefer to hear your proposals before taking a seat. Very well, the Queen Mother continued, her tone showing the first hint of irritation. The current crisis requires immediate appointment of experienced advisors who can guide you through the challenges of early kingship. Lord Blackwood has graciously agreed to serve as your chief advisor, with authority over domestic policy and security matters. This appointment will demonstrate stability to both the nobility and the common people. Additionally, Blackwood added, current security arrangements have proven inadequate for protecting the royal family during these dangerous times. We recommend consolidating guard services under unified command, with personnel selected for their proven loyalty to the crown and their understanding of the current threat environment. Marcus realized that they were witnessing the formal presentation of the conspiracy's demands. Blackwood would assume control over policy while replacing the existing security structure with forces loyal to himself. Once those changes were implemented, Prince Alexander would be a king in name only, with every significant decision subject to Blackwood's approval. These are substantial changes, Alexander observed. What justification exists for implementing them immediately rather than through the normal process of deliberation and consultation? One of the nobles at the table, Lord Pemberton, spoke for the first time. Your Highness, the kingdom cannot afford extended deliberation during a succession crisis. Your father's deteriorating condition means that leadership decisions cannot be delayed, and the threats facing the royal family require immediate response. What specific threats? Alexander asked pointedly. The question seemed to catch the conspirators off guard. They had expected compliance or refusal, not detailed interrogation of their justifications. Queen Mother Isabel exchanged a glance with Blackwood before responding. Intelligence reports indicate coordinated activities among revolutionary groups, specifically targeting you because of your recent public engagements. Captain Sterling's security measures have proven insufficient to address these threats, necessitating more comprehensive approaches. Marcus felt the conversation reaching the critical moment. They were about to demand his removal and replacement with security personnel loyal to their faction. His response to this demand would either force the conspiracy into the open or provide them with the pretext they needed to take more drastic action. Your Majesty, Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the hall, his voice carrying the authority earned through years of faithful service. I would be interested to review these intelligence reports. My sources have indicated different threat patterns than what you're describing. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. Captain Sterling, these matters are being discussed at a level above your normal responsibilities. Your continued involvement in security planning may itself constitute a vulnerability that requires addressing. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could see Alexander preparing to defend him, but he also recognized that this was the moment when the conspiracy would reveal its true nature. His response needed to force that revelation while protecting the prince from whatever consequences might follow. Lord Blackwood, my oath is to protect Prince Alexander from all threats, regardless of their source or the political inconvenience my vigilance might create. If you believe my service constitutes a vulnerability, perhaps you could explain specifically how my loyalty to His Highness compromises the kingdom's security. The direct challenge caught Blackwood between the need to maintain his pose as loyal advisor and his desire to remove the primary obstacle to his control over Alexander. His hesitation provided the opening Prince Alexander needed to reassert control over the conversation. Lord Blackwood, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but Captain Sterling has served my family faithfully for many years. Any changes to security arrangements will be made through proper consultation rather than ultimatum. Queen Mother Isabel's diplomatic facade finally cracked. Alexander, you're being naive about the realities you face. The nobility expects decisive leadership during times of crisis, not endless deliberation about obvious necessities. Your refusal to accept guidance from those with greater experience may be interpreted as evidence that you're not ready for the responsibilities of kingship. The threat was now explicit. Marcus watched the nobles around the table carefully, looking for signs of how they would react to this direct challenge to Alexander's fitness to rule. Some appeared uncomfortable with the Queen Mother's tone, while others seemed to be waiting for clearer indication of which faction would prove stronger. Grandmother, Alexander replied with a composure that impressed everyone present, I understand that you believe these measures serve the kingdom's best interests. However, accepting them would establish precedents that could undermine the independence of the crown for generations to come. That's a responsibility I cannot accept lightly. Lord Blackwood rose from his chair, his movement causing several of the guards loyal to his faction to shift their positions slightly. Your Highness, I'm afraid this situation has moved beyond the luxury of extended consideration. The threats facing the kingdom require immediate action, and, if you cannot provide that leadership, others must step forward to preserve stability. Marcus felt the conspiracy finally, revealing its true nature. Blackwood was no longer pretending to offer advice, he was presenting Alexander with the choice between submission and removal. The question now was whether the assembled nobles would support such a drastic action or recoil from its obvious illegitimacy. Are you suggesting that I should abdicate in favor of your judgment? Alexander asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quietness that Marcus recognized as controlled anger. I'm suggesting that the kingdom's welfare must take precedence over any individual's preferences, including those of potential monarchs who may lack the experience necessary for effective leadership during crisis periods. The words constituted treason so obvious that even the nobles who had been hedging their loyalties could not ignore it. Marcus saw several of them exchanging glances that suggested their discomfort with the direction the confrontation had taken. Blackwood had overplayed his hand by making his intentions too explicit too quickly. Prince Alexander took advantage of this moment of uncertainty among the assembled nobles. Lord Blackwood, your suggestion that my fitness to rule should be subject to your approval represents a fundamental challenge to the legitimate succession of the crown. I invite anyone present who supports such a position to declare themselves openly, so that their views can be properly considered. The challenge forced each noble present to choose sides publicly rather than maintaining the ambiguous positions many had adopted. Marcus watched as the political dynamics in the hall shifted dramatically. Several nobles who had seemed supportive of the conspiracy now appeared reluctant to endorse what had become an obvious attempt at usurpation. Lord Pemberton was the first to speak. Lord Blackwood, while I appreciate your concerns about stability, I cannot support any arrangement that would compromise the legitimate succession of the crown. Prince Alexander has demonstrated both intelligence and dedication to the kingdom's welfare. His declaration seemed to provide permission for others to voice their own doubts about the conspiracy. Within minutes, it became clear that Blackwood had miscalculated the extent of noble support for his plans. The very directness that was supposed to compel compliance had instead revealed the illegitimate nature of his ambitions. Queen Mother Isabel recognized that the political momentum was shifting against them. Very well, Alexander. If you insist on rejecting wise counsel in favor of inexperienced independence, you will bear responsibility for the consequences. But, understand that the kingdom's stability cannot be held hostage to your learning process. Marcus sensed that the conspiracy was shifting to its backup plan. Having failed to secure political legitimacy for their control, they would likely attempt to create the crisis that would justify more drastic measures. His suspicions were confirmed when he noticed some of Blackwood's guards beginning to position themselves near the hall's exits. Your Highness, Marcus spoke quietly to Alexander, I recommend we conclude this meeting and return to secure quarters. The political discussion has served its purpose, and remaining here may expose us to escalated tactics. Alexander nodded, recognizing the wisdom of Marcus's assessment. Grandmother, Lord Blackwood, I appreciate your concerns and will give them the consideration they deserve. For now, I believe this discussion has accomplished what it can accomplish." As they prepared to leave, Blackwood made one final attempt to achieve his objectives. "Your Highness, I'm afraid leaving at this moment would be inadvisable. Recent intelligence suggests that revolutionary groups may attempt to exploit any appearance of division among the nobility. For your own safety, it would be better to remain under the protection that has been arranged here." Marcus realized that they were about to be taken hostage under the guise of protective custody. The conspiracy's final gambit was to hold Alexander prisoner while claiming they were protecting him from external threats. Once isolated from loyal supporters, the prince could be coerced into compliance or eliminated if he continued to resist. "Lord Blackwood," Marcus responded firmly, "His Highness will determine his own security arrangements. Any attempt to restrict his movement without his consent would constitute an act of aggression against the crown." The confrontation had reached its decisive moment. Marcus counted the forces arrayed against them and calculated their chances of fighting their way out of the hall if necessary. The odds were poor, but the alternative was allowing Alexander to be captured by the very people who had been plotting against him. Prince Alexander seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Captain Sterling is correct. I will not remain here under duress, regardless of the justifications offered." As they moved toward the hall's exit, several of Blackwood's guards stepped forward to block their path. The pretense of political negotiation was finally abandoned as the conspiracy revealed its willingness to use force to achieve its objectives. Marcus drew his sword, an action that was immediately mirrored by both loyal and hostile guards throughout the hall. The political crisis had become an armed confrontation, with the future of the kingdom hanging in the balance. "Your Highness," Marcus said quietly to Alexander as they faced the hostile guards, "stay close to me and be ready to move quickly when I give the signal." Prince Alexander nodded, his face showing determination rather than fear. "Marcus, whatever happens, I want you to know that your loyalty has meant everything to me." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he prepared for the battle that would determine whether his years of faithful service had been sufficient to protect the prince he had sworn to guard. Around them, the great hall of Valdoria Castle prepared to witness either the preservation of legitimate succession or its violent overthrow. The conspiracy had finally revealed itself completely, and now force would determine what political maneuvering had failed to achieve. Marcus Sterling, captain of the Royal Guard, prepared to fulfill his oath one last time, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether his honor remained intact or lay shattered among the ancient stones of the castle he had served so faithfully.